It is a pleasure tonight to welcome Marjorie Cohn to our meeting. Marjorie is a member of the Veterans for Peace Advisory Board, and she will discuss the new Agent Orange legislation, HR 3518, that was recently introduced to Congress by Representative Barbara Lee. Marjorie will also discuss legal issues in the case of Julian Assange and targeted killing drone warfare. Marjorie is Professor Emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, former president of the National Lawyers Guild, and a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. As I mentioned, she's on the advisory board of Veterans for Peace. Marjorie served as one of 7 judges from 3 continents on the International People's Tribunal of Conscience in support of the Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange in 2009. She is a co-coordinator of the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign. Her books include Rules of Disengagement, The Politics and Honor of Military Dissent. She recently edited Drones and Targeted Killing, a collection of writings about the legal, moral, and political ramifications of unmanned aerial warfare. It is a pleasure tonight to introduce you all to Marjorie. Welcome, Marjorie.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for inviting me. I know many of you. I have met with many of you, some in New York, and it's a real honor for me to be here. So I also want to mention, and you probably know this, that Susan is also a co-coordinator of the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, and we work closely together on that project of Veterans for Peace. So as Susan said, I'm going to start with talking about the legislation that was just introduced in the House by Barbara Lee to compensate Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange and equalize treatment of US veterans and et cetera. And I'll tell you about that bill. And I'm very proud to say that our Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign helped draft this legislation. As many of you know, the Vietnamese people and many American people, American veterans of the Vietnam War, which the Vietnamese call the American War, and Vietnamese Americans continue to suffer the effects of Agent Orange, which is the deadly dioxin-containing chemical that was sprayed over 12% of Vietnam from 1961 to 1971. Descendants of the approximately 2 to 4 million Vietnamese people, hundreds of thousands of US Vietnam vets and Vietnamese Americans who were exposed to the chemical continue to have disproportionate rates of congenital disabilities and higher rates of many diseases. US veterans receive some compensation from the US government, but very little assistance has been given to the Vietnamese people, the intended victims of the defoliant Agent Orange. So on May 25th, Representative Barbara Lee from California introduced HR 3518, and I urge you all to write that down, 3518, HR 3518, so you can contact your congressperson to sign on as a co-sponsor. It's called the Victims of Agent Orange Relief Act of 2021. And Barbara Lee said, and I was writing an article about this, and she was introducing the bill. It hadn't even been put up yet on the congressional website. But the quote is, the United States, this is from Barbara Lee, who introduced the bill. The United States has a moral responsibility to compensate the victims of the Agent Orange campaign. In the same way, we are focused on beginning to repair the damage of systemic racism in the form of reparations and the war on drugs with restorative justice. It is also our responsibility to try and atone for this disgraceful campaign during the Vietnam War. Now, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the DVA, recognizes 15 different diseases and illnesses associated with the spraying and use of Agent Orange. And although the DVA provides some, albeit insufficient, compensation for 20 severe congenital disabilities in children of female U.S. vets who served in Vietnam, the only congenital condition recognized for children of male U.S. vets is spina bifida. So there's a real inequality there. But no assistance has been provided to the children of Vietnamese or Vietnamese Americans associated with their exposure or their parents' or grandparents' exposure to Agent Orange. So the HR 3518 would expand benefits to children of veterans exposed to Agent Orange, expand research on Agent Orange and its effects on the health of exposed individuals, and provide medical, housing, and poverty reduction assistance to Vietnamese individuals affected by exposure as well as their children. It would also provide environmental remediation for areas in Vietnam exposed to Agent Orange and conduct a needs assessment on the Vietnamese American community. It would provide grants that fund a broad health assessment for Vietnamese Americans who may have been exposed to Agent Orange, as well as their children and descendants. And it would establish centers that provide assessment, counseling, and treatment for conditions related to exposure to Agent Orange in areas with large Vietnamese American populations. Today, dozens of environmental hotspots continue to contaminate the soil, food, sediment, wildlife, and livestock in Vietnam with dioxin. In 2017, the United States assisted in cleaning up the Agent Orange contamination at the largest hotspot at the Da Nang airport. In addition, the U.S. has pledged $30 million a year for 10 years toward the cleanup of the hotspot at Bien Hoa, but the total cost may exceed $1 billion. And there are several other smaller hotspots throughout Vietnam that must also be cleaned up as they continue to expose the people there to dioxin and arsenic. The U.S. cleaned up Da Nang Airport and reduced the risk of dioxin exposure to the surrounding community. But now we're working on Bien Hoa, the largest remaining dioxin hotspot. And the bill provides for additional cleanup in areas that were heavily sprayed, such as areas that served as military bases and sites of civilian, sites of aircraft crashes. Now, Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange filed a lawsuit in 2014 against the chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange. And in 2008, U.S. District Judge Jack Weinstein, who recently passed away, who had also presided over a prior lawsuit by U.S. veterans, which settled and gave U.S. veterans some money, and then Congress kicked in more. But he assured the chemical companies, Monsanto and Dow and the rest, that their liability was over. And so there has been no compensation for, through the courts, for the Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange. So since I have two other topics to discuss, I'm going to move on to them. And then when we come back afterwards, after I give my opening remarks, we can have questions and answers. So my second topic is Julian Assange, who is facing 175 years in prison and is in a high security prison in London at the moment. It's not really clear to most people, because the corporate media has really blacked it out, why Julian Assange poses such a threat to the US government, or why the US government perceives him to be such a threat. And it's because in 2010 and 2011, based upon data and documents that were provided by Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange published evidence of US war crimes in Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo, and the CIA black sites. This is the basis for 17 charges against Julian Assange under the Espionage Act, amounting to 170 years. I'll talk about the other 5 years in a minute. So the disclosures by WikiLeaks included 400,000 field reports about the Iraq War, 15,000 unreported deaths of Iraqi civilians, and evidence of the systematic torture, murder, and rape after U.S. forces handed over detainees to a notorious Iraqi torture squad. The Afghan war logs are 90,000 reports about the war in Afghanistan, revealing more civilian casualties by coalition forces than the U.S. military had admitted to. And the Guantanamo files, 779 secret reports that showed 150 innocent people had been imprisoned there for years and documented the U.S. government's torture and abuse of 800 men and boys in violation of the Geneva Conventions and the Convention Against Torture. But the most notable release by WikiLeaks was the 2007 collateral murder video depicting a U.S. Army Apache helicopter gunship in Baghdad target and fire at unarmed civilians. At least 18 civilians were killed, including 2 Reuters journalists and a man who tried to rescue the wounded. 2 children were injured, and a U.S. Army tank drove over one of the bodies, cutting it in half. And the collateral murder video contains evidence of 3 different war crimes under the Geneva Conventions. Now, the reason that the Obama administration, which prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all the prior presidents combined, the reason that they refrained from charging Julian Assange was because of the so-called New York Times problem. The New York Times problem is as follows. No journalist or media outlet has ever been prosecuted under the Espionage Act for publishing truthful information. The First Amendment allows journalists to publish material that was illegally obtained by a third person if it's a matter of public concern. The US government has never prosecuted a journalist or a newspaper for publishing classified information, which constitutes an essential tool of journalism. And so the Obama administration looked at the Assange case and decided not to prosecute for fear of establishing a precedent that could chill investigative reporting about national security matters by treating it as a crime. And that's a quote from Charlie Savage of the New York Times. Obama could not distinguish between what WikiLeaks did and what news media organizations like the Times do in soliciting and publishing information the government wants to keep secret. But the Trump administration exercised no such forbearance. They charged Assange. First, they charged him in an indictment with a count of conspiracy to commit computer intrusion, also known as hacking. Then in a superseding indictment, they added 17 charges under the Espionage Act, amounting to 170 years exposure. And then they filed a second superseding indictment to try to beef up the initial hacking charge. The reason that they were so intent on beefing up the hacking charge is that they knew that if Julian Assange is a journalist, then it violates the First Amendment to prosecute him. But if he can be shown to be a hacker, then they can prosecute him. And the first hacking charge that had to do with Chelsea Manning was so weak, the evidence supporting it was so weak, and what came out at Julian Assange's extradition hearing from a forensic expert was that there really was not sufficient evidence of hacking. And that's why the Trump administration filed this second superseding indictment to beef up the computer hacking charge so that to get around the fact that he's a journalist. And the allegations in the second superseding indictment were based on allegations by Sigurdur Thordarson in Iceland, and many of the statements about hacking in the decision of the judge on the espionage, not the espionage, but the extradition decision, drew on Thordarson's testimony. Well, recently, Thordarson has admitted that he lied with all of these allegations, which means that the hacking charge totally falls apart, which means that it leaves the indicting a journalist for First Amendment activity. And the Trump administration has been trying to get Julian Assange extradited to the United States to stand trial on this indictment and these charges under the Espionage Act and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. But the judge, after the extradition hearing with lots of evidence, denied extradition, denied the U.S. government the right to extradite Julian Assange to the United States for trial. She issued her decision in January, I think it was January 4th, but she didn't base it on the First Amendment and the threat to journalism and those allegations. She based it on humanitarian grounds because there was so much testimony at the extradition hearing that first of all, a UN Special Rapporteur, after a lengthy investigation, determined that Julian Assange had been subjected to prolonged psychological torture from his years in confinement in Britain. And there was testimony from US prison officials saying that if Julian Assange was extradited to the United States, he would be held in a supermax prison in solitary confinement 23 hours a day, subjected to special administrative measures, which are very onerous conditions of confinement, isolating him from all other individuals. And there was psychiatric testimony that he would be a prime candidate for committing suicide. So the judge, in her denial of extradition, said that she basically indicted the US prison system and said that they could not protect Julian Assange from committing suicide. So the Trump administration appealed her denial of extradition to the higher court in Britain, but Biden has not dismissed the appeal. Biden has continued the appeal, and we are trying to get Biden to dismiss it. And so what the Biden administration is doing now to try to bolster their case on appeal, because the high court has just granted the right to appeal the denial of extradition, is to present new evidence on appeal. I was a trial lawyer and an appellate lawyer for many years, and I know that it's a basic rule of criminal rule that evidence needs to be presented at the trial. You don't present new evidence for the first time on appeal. And yet what the Biden administration is doing is to give assurances to the appellate court that Julian Assange would not be held in a supermax prison and would not be subjected to these special administrative measures, unless, of course, he does something that warrants that in the future. They left the door open. And that he'd get therapy and counseling, and that he could serve any time he gets, if he's convicted, in Australia. He's an Australian citizen. Well, first of all, this evidence should have been presented at the extradition hearing. Second of all, it's not really the US government's call to decide where Julian Assange would serve any potential sentence. That is up to Australia. But they're clutching at straws. They really want to get him. And that's because they're so threatened that Julian Assange revealed evidence of US war crimes. So that's where it stands now. It is in the high court. If the Biden administration continues this appeal, and there have been civil liberties groups and people all over the world urging Biden to drop the appeal, but if Biden continues the appeal and the high court denies his appeal, then he can appeal to the Supreme Court of Britain, but that's discretionary with them. They don't have to hear that appeal. And if the US government does succeed in getting a reversal of the judge's denial of extradition, then Julian Assange can appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, because that protects freedom of the press, anti-torture, etc. So who knows how much longer Julian Assange, who is in very, very poor health, will be incarcerated. Anything anybody can do to contact the White House and the Department of Justice, because Merrick Garland is central to this whole appeal, could help to urge the Biden administration to drop the appeal of the denial of extradition. And then my third topic is drones. Nick, of course, is with us, and Nick has been instrumental in the anti-drone movement, and I admire his work greatly. We've met, we've worked together, and I'm just so proud of the work that he and many other people have done. As you know, Biden, to his credit, is withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. But that doesn't mean that the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan is over, because he is apparently going to continue to bomb Afghanistan with weaponized drones. On July 2nd, Biden participated in a press conference, and he was asked this question: if there's evidence that Kabul is threatened, which some of the intelligence reports have suggested it could be in 6 months or thereabout, do you think you got the capability to help provide any kind of air support, military support to them to keep the capital safe, even if the US troops are obviously fully out by that time? And Biden responded, we have worked out an over the horizon capacity. I want to repeat that. Over the horizon capacity that we can be value added. But the Afghans are going to have to be able to do it themselves with the Air Force they have, which we're helping them maintain. So what is this over the horizon capacity that can be value added? Well, this is a plan that is estimated to cost $10 billion to fly weaponized drones as well as manned bombers from bases in Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, US bases. Over the horizon air operations, probably directed at the Taliban, may very well rely on very heavily on weaponized drones and drone targeting for manned aircraft. Now, Biden has placed some temporary limits on drone strikes, but he is supposedly studying the matter. There was an article today in the New York Times that reported that the U.S. military yesterday mounted a drone attack in Somalia. Continuing, Obama droned 7 different countries, took droning to a new level. Of course, we know that Bush committed, incredible war crimes and started the drone program, and then Obama continued it, beefed it up. Trump continued using attack drones, and Biden is continuing that. The Biden administration has placed some new limits on drone strikes outside of war zones. Trump delegated the decision about whether to use drones, whether to bomb using drones, to field commanders. And Biden is kind of going back to the Obama policy of requiring that take place in the White House. Obama instituted what are called kill lists, where every Tuesday they would sit around and decide who was going to die that week. It was micromanaged. The drone program was micromanaged by the White House. But in this particular drone attack in Somalia, apparently it didn't require White House approval because the Africa Command has the authority to conduct strikes in support of allied forces under what the military calls collective self-defense. When I hear that, it just makes my blood boil, being an international lawyer and studying and teaching international law. because regardless of what authorization for the use of military force happens to be in effect on any given day, and there is a legislation by 3 senators to try to weaken that, or to try to get that power, wrest the power away from the president and put it in the hands of Congress. But nevertheless, the UN Charter, which we are bound by because it's a treaty the US has ratified, making it part of US law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, says that all disputes have to be handled peacefully and no country can invade another country except in self-defense. And self-defense means self-defense against an armed attack. Well, there's been no armed attack on the US or US allies. There is internal conflict in Somalia and many of these other countries, but that is not lawful self-defense under the UN Charter. I want to turn now to Daniel Hale, because I know that Veterans for Peace has been very involved in Daniel Hale's case. He's a whistleblower. He's facing sentencing on July 27th. He's facing 10 years in prison. And at the time that I edited my book, Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues, we didn't know it was Daniel Hale who was the source for what were called the drone papers. In 2015, a whistleblower, turns out it was Daniel Hale, provided The Intercept with a treasure trove of secret military documents. And this is what that was published by The Intercept under the title The Drone Papers. They were very comprehensive. They revealed the kill chain that decides who will be targeted. And the source, which was Daniel Hale, said, this outrageous explosion of watch listing, of monitoring people and racking and stacking them on lists, assigning them numbers, assigning them baseball cards, assigning them death sentences without notice on a worldwide battlefield, it was from the very first instance wrong. And then he provided information to The Intercept about signals intelligence in undeclared war zones where they follow cell phones or computers that may or may not be carried by suspected terrorists. It may be that someone handed his cell phone to his grandmother, and yet she would be in the sights of the drone and be bombed based on this signals intelligence. And Daniel Hale criticized this program and the people deciding who was going to be targeted as having, he called it godlike powers. He said it's stunning the number of instances when selectors are misattributed to certain people, and he characterized a missile fired at a target, fired at a group of people, as a leap of faith, a leap of faith. The drone papers showed that during a 5-month period, almost 90% of the people killed in airstrikes were not the intended targets. The drone papers say anyone caught in the vicinity is guilty by association. So Daniel Hale said, it's a phenomenal gamble. Well, starting in 2013, Daniel Hale was working as a private contractor. He leaked 17 classified documents about the drone program to investigative reporter Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept. And it exposed that between January of 2012 and February of 2013, the U.S. Special Operations airstrikes killed more than 200 people. Only 35 of those were the intended targets. Hale was coerced by Biden's Justice Department at the end of March to plead guilty to 1 count of violating the Espionage Act because they were threatening him with 50 years in prison. Now he's facing a maximum of 10 years in prison. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention, and this is something else that Daniel Hale revealed to The Intercept, was Obama engaged in what are called signature strikes. So even if there is no target identified, if there are military age men, say between 16 and 65, in a certain area, then they are assumed to be terrorists, and there can be drone strikes. And this is one of the most alarming things about Obama's program, which has apparently been continued by Trump and by Biden. Now, in December, anti-drone activists, including VFP's Sean Westmoreland and Lisa Ling, together with Elsa Roshbach, who is an anti-drone activist, scored a very important victory in Germany. Because of the opposition that they, including the National Bird Film and including a tremendous opposition movement, it caused the German military establishment or parliament it forced them to delay arming drones that Germany has been leasing from Israel. Now, at the end of June, 113 organizations, including VFP, these are human rights organizations, civil rights, civil liberties, racial, social, environmental justice, faith-based organizations, writing to Biden demanding an end to the unlawful program of lethal strikes outside of any recognized battlefield, including through the use of drones. And they wrote in the letter, successive presidents have now claimed the unilateral power to authorize secretive extrajudicial killing outside any recognized battlefield, with no meaningful accountability for wrongful deaths and civilian lives lost and injured. The lethal strikes program is a cornerstone of the broader U.S. war-based approach, which has led to wars and other violent conflicts, hundreds of thousands dead, including significant civilian casualties, massive human displacement, and indefinite military detention and torture. It has caused lasting psychological trauma and deprived families of beloved members. And I just want to end my prepared remarks with this is hot off the press as of yesterday. Chris Murphy, Bernie Sanders, and Mike Lee, and it's actually it's not just Democrats. Chris Murphy is a Democrat, Bernie Sanders is an independent, and Mike Lee is a Republican, and they want to make it easier to block weapon sales and sunset these authorizations for the use of military force and hand the power back to Congress, which is what the War Powers Resolution is about. The War Powers Resolution was enacted after the Vietnam War to give Congress the power to say no to the president before, and the president can, if he or she, so far, introduces U.S. forces into hostilities or immediate hostilities, then he has to report to Congress and every 60 days, and Congress has the right to say no. And of course, Congress rarely says no. Democrats and Republicans alike, they love military contractors. They continue to pass these bloated military budgets. I'm preaching to the choir here. Meanwhile, people are suffering in this country and in other countries. And so what this provision would do, that was just introduced yesterday, would cut off funding for military actions which were not explicitly authorized by Congress. And it would tighten the definition of hostilities, the president introducing U.S. forces into hostilities under the War Powers Resolution to cover not just cases of military forces on the ground, but also troops deployed irrespective of the domain. Hostilities not approved by Congress would be required to end 20 days after the president reports to Congress rather than the current 60 days. And this would sunset, in other words, it would end after 180 days. It directs Congress to proactively approve certain sales that are more than $14 million, including air-to-ground munitions. But here's the catch: the restraint on arms sales would not apply to, who do you think? Israel and other U.S. allies, because of course those are our allies, NATO allies, Israel, key defense partners. So there is a presumption that, and it seems to be a non-rebuttable, a conclusive presumption that any weapon systems that are appropriated for Israel and our other allies are justified. So I think I'm going to stop there, I think we'll have a discussion. But thank you so much for inviting me to give those remarks.
Thank you, Marjorie. I'd like to ask if there are any questions or comments.
Jewel has her hand up.
Good. Go ahead, Ellen. We'll call on people. Go ahead.
Okay, so Jewel, go ahead.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Marjorie, for all the important updates. You are one of our great activist attorneys in the tradition of Lynn Stewart and Bill Kunstler. Thank you so much. So you referred to the American mainstream media blackout, maybe we should call it a whiteout, of Julian Assange's case. But we have a very recent example regarding Daniel Hale. So on Saturday here in New York, for the press conference, some city desk editor at NBC TV, Channel 4 in New York, decided that the press conference was newsworthy and sent out a camera person who stayed the full hour and covered it, told us that the story would be cut and shown sometime during the 6 o'clock hour, and 2 hours after that, the footage would be archived. Best we can make out, the footage, the story, if ever cut, has been totally deep-sixed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Doesn't surprise me. By the way, I never call it the mainstream media. I call it the corporate media. I don't consider it to be in the mainstream, and it certainly is controlled by corporations. Just to want to make that clear. This doesn't surprise me. The corporate media does the bidding of its corporate masters, which is to smooth over any revelation of war crimes, which of course is what Daniel Hale did and what Julian Assange did. And you see almost nothing about either of those cases in the corporate media. You have to go to the alternate media, for example, Truth Out and some of the radio and TV stations where I and other people do commentary. But we're not getting any help from the corporate media on these cases, which means that it's up to us to bring the truth to the people of this country.
Just a follow-up, if I may, Marjorie. So in light of how widespread the story about the Israeli spyware company has gone, would it make sense for us to dig in and find out at NBC what happened? Who assigned the camera person? What happened to that footage? Do we have any rights to see that footage? Could we do a FOIA?
You certainly could do a Freedom of Information Act request, and investigative journalism is still not illegal. Julian Assange hasn't been tried and convicted and sentenced yet. Hopefully he won't be. So investigative journalism is really central to the First Amendment, freedom of the press. And the Supreme Court has said that the press, the media, is a surrogate for the public's right to know. So I think that, the more investigation, the better. I encourage people to dig in.
Thank you.
Tom has a hand up. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you very much for your comments, Marjorie. I have a question about the Agent Orange case that the Vietnamese victims brought, and that you said Judge Weinstein more or less assured the corporations that liability was not going to be an issue for them. How final was that? Was that decision appealable? Where does that stand, or is it just over legally?
It was a settlement. The settlement was in the case of the U.S. vets. There was a settlement there. They got a little bit of money, and then Congress came through with more money. Not enough, but more money. But when the Vietnamese victims sued Dow and Monsanto, they were kicked out of court because Judge Weinstein had apparently promised the chemical companies that their liability was over. There is another case that came down 2 weeks before the introduction of Barbara Lee's bill on Agent Orange. A French court dismissed a lawsuit by Tran Ta Ngoy, a French Vietnamese victim of Agent Orange. And she was one of the witnesses who testified in the People's Tribunal of Conscience for the Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange that Susan alluded to in her introduction in 2009 in Paris, where I served as one of 7 judges from 3 continents. And we heard testimony from 27 different, we heard Vietnam veterans and journalists and victims and scientists and experts, and came up with quite a comprehensive report about the war crimes being committed. But she was one of the victims who testified, and she was in Vietnam acting as she's a Vietnamese French woman acting as a journalist, and she was with some other people when a plane flew over, and she was enveloped in a cloud of Agent Orange. And when her first daughter was born, her skin peeled off all the time. She could not have any physical affection. She died very, very young, and her other children have also had diseases as a result of Agent Orange. And so Madame Ngoy brought a lawsuit in 2014 against 14 chemical companies, including Dow and Monsanto, that produced and sold Agent Orange. And the court in France ruled that it didn't have jurisdiction to hear the case because the companies had acted on the orders of the US government, which was involved in a sovereign act. She is appealing that decision. There is quite an international movement to support her. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that at the VFP convention in August on our Agent Orange panel, our Agent Orange workshop that Susan has organized, that her case will be discussed. I don't know if Madame Ngoy will be there, but I know that her case will be discussed during that workshop.
Right, and the people that we'll hear from are the young people who are organizing demonstrations in support of Madame Ngoy and against the chemical companies. And the case goes on because it sounds as though Madame Ngoy is appealing the case through the courts in France. The original VAVA case was appealed in the United States, was lost on appeal, and then there was an attempt to bring it before the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the history about why we got involved in writing legislation and having legislation introduced to the House.
Mm-hmm. Nick has his hand up.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much, Marjorie, for being so vigilant about drone warfare from the very beginning and applying the law to these behaviors. Thing I wondered if you could bring us up to date on what would be the possibilities of getting a court such as the one in Spain who wanted to jail Pinochet. What would be the likelihood or path or status of any effort to charge Obama and Biden and drone war underlings in the chain of command that Daniel Hale revealed, to cause them to be brought to some court for some kind of ruling on war crimes?
Well, first of all, let me say that the International Criminal Court has mounted a formal investigation, and this is really monumental because they've mostly gone after African leaders, but they have mounted a formal investigation of US military and CIA officials, in addition to Afghan officials, for war crimes committed during the Afghan war, and that was during the Bush administration, but that case is pending. And because of that formal investigation, the Trump administration slapped sanctions on officials of the International Criminal Court and the chief prosecutor. The U.S. is not a party to the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute. As he left office, Bill Clinton signed the treaty, the Rome Statute, and signing a treaty indicates an intent to ratify. It also means that that country that signed the treaty cannot take action inconsistent with the object and purpose of the treaty. But as Bill Clinton was leaving, he told George W. Bush, I don't recommend that you send it to the Senate for advice and consent to ratification, 2/3 under the Constitution. Not only did Bush not send Rome Statute to the Senate for advice and consent to ratification, in an unprecedented move, Bush unsigned the Rome Statute, took the U.S. signature off. John Bolton did the honors. So the U.S. is not a party to the Rome Statute. There's also an investigation of Israel, by the way. Israel isn't a party either. But under the Rome Statute, if war crimes took place on the territory of a country that is a party to the Rome Statute, then they can still take jurisdiction. Now, whether or not first of all, it means the prosecutor mounting a preliminary examination that can go on for years. And if she, it just became a he, chief prosecutor decides that there's sufficient evidence, then he can ask the pretrial chamber of the International Criminal Court to mount a formal investigation. So it's not clear whether that would happen, but it means mobilizing lots and lots of civil society organizations and individuals to bring that evidence to the prosecutor's office of Obama and company's commission of war crimes and illegal use of drones. Now, you mentioned Spain, and that is not under the International Criminal Court. That is under the well-established doctrine of universal jurisdiction, which was used by Israel after the Holocaust to charge, convict, and hang Adolf Eichmann for his crimes during the Holocaust. He was the architect of the Holocaust, even though they didn't directly relate to Israel. And the U.S. has used universal jurisdiction as well to try, convict, and sentence Chucky Taylor of Liberia to many years in federal prison for torture, which is also a war crime. Universal jurisdiction is a doctrine that says that some crimes are so atrocious, and we're talking genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, war of aggression, are so heinous that that any country can try them because they're crimes against all of humanity. Well, during the Obama administration, Spain was investigating Donald Rumsfeld for war crimes, the torture. And for a few delicious months, Donald Rumsfeld was afraid to travel outside of the United States for fear that some other country that was a party, some other country, not strike that, but another country would arrest him and send him to Spain for trial. So what the Spanish government did was to basically backdoor the Obama administration, and they sent a letter to the Obama administration saying, are you investigating Rumsfeld? And there were two other some torture lawyers as well. They were that were the subject of this. Are you investigating them for criminal charges? And because the universal jurisdiction and the International Criminal Court, both, they're separate proceedings, they both work on the principle of complementarity. They complement, but they don't supersede the national system. So if the US government was effectively investigating Rumsfeld for war crimes, then there wouldn't be any universal jurisdiction investigation. Well, the Obama administration wrote back a letter which was non-responsive, which says, well, there was an ethical investigation, and it just concluded that these people used poor judgment. It had been professional misconduct until a political appointee downgraded it to poor judgment. And so Spain, who was threatened behind the scenes, in all likelihood, dropped this universal jurisdiction investigation. And the same thing happened in Belgium. Rumsfeld was in Belgium and the 3 torture lawyers were in Spain. I'm sorry, I conflated those two. So the short answer is, if there is enough evidence presented to the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and or the civil society anti-drone activists can convince any other country to mount an investigation under universal jurisdiction, then it is a possibility. Is it a probability? Probably not. Is it likely? But that's the long and short answer to your question.
Okay, we have 3 more questions, and then I think maybe we should close it off because it's been a lot.
Sure.
So we have Rachel, and there's a question in the chat, and then there's Paul. So Rachel, go ahead.
Yes, Marjorie, thank you so much for your stories. It's just the amount of information is enormous. And I have several questions, but some of them were already answered by other people. So as for the Agent Orange, what was the major what was the key element that those chemical companies were no longer responsible? Why we cannot prosecute them at this point?
Because Jack Weinstein, the federal court judge, said that there was not sufficient evidence that Agent Orange was a poisoned weapon under the Hague Convention.
But
I know, that's what he said, and that was the basis for the decision.
There's so much scientific evidence that prove that, right?
Yeah, and Jack Weinstein has died, and I hate to speak ill of the dead. I mean, Rumsfeld's died as well. I'm not sorry that they're dead, but nevertheless, I don't want to speak ill of them. But Jack Weinstein, I think, was in the pocket of the chemical companies.
Well, definitely for sure.
Yeah.
I recently found out
Rachel, we have 2 other questions, so maybe if we could keep it brief.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fine.
And just quickly, so we move from litigation into
Yes.
legislation.
Okay.
And that, again, what Marjorie said earlier is encouraging everybody to get your representative to sign on to this legislation.
Yeah.
The campaign has started and will continue to get information out.
Thank you.
Thank
I'm fine. Thank you.
Yes, sorry,
Thank
I'm just. So we have a question in the chat from Steve Geiger, who says, how can I find out if Agent Orange was present at the 2 bases at which I was stationed, Utapao and Anderson in Guam?
Susan, you want to answer that?
You know what? I see Paul Cox's face on here, and it's not just that I'm going to kick it over to Paul, but I think, Steve, we need to get back to you because there's ongoing information and studies that are identifying how the Agent Orange, in fact, was transferred from the United States through on to Vietnam. And we actually do have a rather comprehensive report from Government Accounting Office, but I honestly have to go back and take a look at it. I believe it was transitioned through bases on Guam, but we'd have to look. Unless, Paul, you want to add to that?
He was the last hand up anyway.
I can't really add to that except to say that Agent Orange was, hey, this is the wonder drug. We're going to use it everywhere. And so the answer is probably yes, but proof is another issue.
Right.
Actually, apropos of your thing about Rumsfeld, Marjorie, it was one of your colleagues, Clarence Darrow, who said, I have never killed a man, but I've read many obituaries with great pleasure.
I am honored, Paul, that you say that Clarence Darrow is my colleague. That's
well, or maybe one of your ancestors. I don't know, no, and the stuff about Daniel Hale is just so disturbing, and I wish there was more that we could do on this matter. But my question is, the Ferris Doctrine was just partially overturned. so that children of GIs who are suffer medical malpractice at the hands of the military hospitals can now sue the military for that. That's a partial overturning the Ferris Doctrine, where he says you can't sue the military when you're in the military, or if you've been in the military. You can't sue the US government. And is there some way that could be wiggled into an Agent Orange issue? Could the children of US veterans invoke that new policy?
I think it's a great idea. I think our legal team should look into it, Paul. Great suggestion.
Okay.
Yeah.
And lastly, what can we do about Daniel Hale this week?
I'm sorry, can I ask Nick Modern to talk about upcoming activities?
Okay.
In New York City on Saturday from 2 to 5 p.m., there are 2 shifts. People are going to be handing out leaflets on the High Line at this drone sculpture, urging people to be in touch with Daniel Hale, the judge in his case, and also to seek a pardon from Biden. Other activities are going on in other places in the network of anti-drone organizers, but the main thing I think people can do on this call, if they haven't done so already, is to go to the website called standwithdanielhale.org, and they have a list of things to do, all very simple. It doesn't take very long. And also, they do keep that very much up to date with respect to how the legal case is progressing. So those are I think the 2 main things. Marjorie may want to add, or somebody else may want to add to that, but I think those are the things that we can do. However inadequate that seems to feel against the determination of the government to suppress the truth of whom we're killing. So.
Yeah, I thank you for that, Nick, and for your work in solidarity with Daniel Hale. I know that both the White House and the Department of Justice and Congress members do respond to pressure, and I don't think it would hurt anything to overwhelm them with calls and emails and letters to the editor, for example. Not hard to get them published, but there has to be something you're responding to. And since the corporate media has basically blacked out the story of Daniel Hale, I think that won't be easy to find. But I just want to add one other thing about Julian Assange, and that is to direct people to the website AssangeDefense.org, which is Assange Defense is the organization that I work with on the national level, on the advisory board, and also the Los Angeles branch of Assange Defense. And there's a tremendous amount of information on that website and how people can support Julian Assange's case, AssangeDefense.org.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
I have 2 things. I just wanted to, I put up this picture of the drone statue where we did the press conference last Saturday, and people will be leafleting at 30th Street and 10th Avenue, the High Line. And I just wanted people to see this incredible statue, how powerful it is. And also I missed earlier, Ellen had put a question in the chat about the Danang cleanup materials, the dirt and everything that you talked about. Where did all the contaminated materials get put, and who else is getting contaminated with that?
We could probably spend the next hour talking about the impact of the cleanup, and I would defer again to Paul, who has done a lot of research and study on this. It's not as though the dirt got put someplace else, but he can talk about the heating of the earth and to be able to get rid of the dioxin that was in the ground. But Paul, we have a couple minutes.
No, I can do this very quickly. They put it in, they built a big reservoir. They put it 94,000 cubic meters of soil in there, and they heated it to about 300 degrees centigrade, or about 500 degrees Fahrenheit, and burned off, destroyed all the dioxin, and then they put it back on, just scattered it around the airport. So it's there now, but it has been decontaminated. The Phuket Air Base, the second hotspot, has been they've put it in a containment and covered it, and they're not going to do any more. It's not in an urban area, not that big a deal. The one that remains is Bien Hoa, just outside of Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City, and it's 3 times bigger, at least 3 times bigger, and much more widespread than and done a lot more damage than the Da Nang airport hotspot did. But Da Nang is fixed, and the DoD has promised $30 million a year for 10 years to begin the process of fixing Bien Hoa, the third big hotspot.
Thank you. Thank you. On behalf of all of us, Marjorie, thank you so much for coming to the meeting tonight. Are there any other questions? Right, we all learned a lot. And I think understand that there's a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And you know, there's so many issues. It's just hard to keep. It's like whack-a-mole, you know. And they're all related. They're all related, and that's why we have Veterans for Peace.
Thank you. But you've given us an additional knowledge and understanding of what the issues are and how involved they are and how they do all connect. And our work is moving forward on all of these. So thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie.
To be continued.
See you all at the convention.
Yes. So on that note, I was going to ask for reports, our ongoing monthly reports. And I guess I thought we could move in to talk about the report from Nick. Is there any additional information that we should have?
I think, no, I think that Zool put in the chat, please join us Saturday, and certainly